Hi, it's Daniel Priya here, and welcome to another episode of Pogchamps Blunders Explained. Today, we're going to be looking at a game played between xQc and Easywithaces. And before we begin, we need to point out that chess is a very complicated game, and these players are not professionals. Even professionals blunder very frequently, so it's absolutely normal to see blunders like this in chess games. And the reason we are analyzing these blunders, not just from a chess perspective, but going beyond to really understand what the inner game is underneath the surface, is because we can learn from that. So in general, you can learn a lot from your own mistakes, but you can also learn from other people's mistakes. And we can all learn something from what happened only if we analyze these mistakes more deeply and understand how exactly to avoid them in the future. So the first game started with the move d4. In this game, xQc is playing with the black pieces, Easywithaces is playing with the white pieces. And the first thing to mention about this game is that xQc actually had been streaming for 20 hours before the beginning of the game. So before this, xQc had already been streaming for 20 hours. Now, of course, chess is only one of the multiple things that xQc is doing. And we understand that it may or may not be his priority. Having said that, from a pure chess perspective, it's actually a big disadvantage to play after streaming for 20 hours already because of decision-making fatigue and tiredness and so on. So in general, if you have an important game and if you can afford to prioritize that as opposed to other things, which probably wasn't the case for xQc, so it's understandable, but if you really want to maximize the output of this particular game that you're playing, you really want to rest a little bit more, maybe get enough sleep, and not stream for 20 hours before this very important game. And you may argue that, hey, this didn't transpire during the game, but in reality it did. In fact, xQc played quite slowly, a little bit more slowly than usual. And after the move d5, c4, xQc thought for over a minute. Now, d4, d5, c4 is definitely the most common reply after d5. So here, you really cannot afford to think for more than a minute in a 10-minute game because it doesn't make any sense. So this was really the result of xQc potentially being tired after 20 hours and also some lack of preparation. We're not talking about some strange line, something unusual. We're talking about the most popular way to play after d4, d5, which is c4. So you really want to know exactly what to do in this case before the start of the game. So interestingly enough, xQc played a move that is considered inferior. The reason it's considered inferior, it's because this allows pawn takes, which was not played in the game, by the way, but the reason knight f6 is inferior is because after pawn takes, knight takes, knight f3, avoiding potentially e5, next e4 is coming, and white gets a big center. So in general, black prefers to keep a pawn in the center. So we understand in these blunders, again, the chess explanation of this blunder is that xQc failed to realize that this knight, once at d5, would be kicked out of here, and that it's important to keep a pawn in the center, but there is a lot more than that, and that's why we are pointing out how xQc arrived tired to this game, and it's really very important to be prepared. So that's really, the main mistake here is really the lack of preparation, which goes beyond the actual move that was played in the game. So in your games, you really want to be prepared on what to do on move 2. You can't start thinking of the board unless your opponent plays something extremely unusual, like, I don't know, a3, something really unexpected. But if the second move is the most popular move, you really need to know in advance what you're going to do, because there's nothing you can really calculate at this stage. Sometimes maybe you want to think, okay, which type of opening am I going to play? But after d4, d5, you don't have a lot of options, so it's really unjustified to spend a lot of time on this move. especially if you're going to make an inferior move like knight f6. Now here what happened was white didn't capture, but rather decided to transpose to something more familiar. So funnily enough, after one more move, we reach a position that is a theoretical position, very, very standard, it's been played so many times. And here we want to point out this mistake as well. You may argue that it makes sense just to transpose to something familiar when you see something that you're not used to. Having said that, if you really want to improve in chess, you want to start punishing your opponent for sloppy opening play. So if there is something that doesn't look right, like, hey, this doesn't look right, this knight on d5 will be kicked out later on, then you want to really, even if you spend like a few seconds here, go for it and challenge what your opponent is doing. Having said that, I don't want to be too harsh, because it's understandable that if you don't see it clearly, you just want to play something safe that you know how to play. Here, for example, after takes, the move e4 is recommended by many sources, but in reality, after this, and say for example knight c3 to defend this pawn, e5 is already possible. e5 is already possible here, so it's not so obvious here. Usually white wants to start with knight f3 to avoid e5 and only then play e4. So this is just to show how really there is a point in just going for the familiar variation rather than something completely unusual. So it's a matter of choice. Just in general, if you really want to improve, you'll have to learn how to punish this type of opening play that is not that testing. So the game here continues. Now this is quite interesting. This move is also a mistake, so we'll have to point it out. And again, we're not analyzing the entire game. We're simply focusing on the mistakes, trying to understand why the mistakes were made. And here, this was potentially a trap. So here, it looks like black can win a pawn by capturing here, but if white can win a pawn like this, but after captures, you know, this knight is not really pinned, because this bishop e4 check, winning back the queen. So this was a simple trap, but unfortunately this trap doesn't work, because there is another way to win this pawn, which is to capture the bishop, to capture the knight with the bishop and then capturing in the center. So here white is up a pawn. So this was a mistake, because you know, sometimes you're trying to set a trap focusing on one variation, but then there's some other variation which is better, and your opponent plays that variation, and you will regret that you have tried to trick your opponent. So very, very important, you know, to make moves that are good. If some move is good and it's also tricky, great, maybe your opponent will fall for the trap. But if you make a move that is not good and is only intended to trick your opponent, unless you have a specific reason to do that, then it's not a good idea. If the game is almost over and it's your last chance and it's a must-win situation, you know, then go for the trick, fair enough. But in the opening at this stage, it's really unjustified to go for a trap that just eventually gives you a worse position. And again, if a trap doesn't work against someone who's a non-professional, it probably won't work against strong players either. So definitely not recommended to play for cheap traps in the opening. And here there's a very common pattern that we'll see. Now I'm not talking about this move specifically, because it's fine to support the knight, but these pawns got a little bit overextended at some point and became a bit of a target. And you'll see the exact same thing in the second game as well. So Easywithaces played very well, but there's a few things that can be noticed from the style of play, that he had this tendency of overextending the central pawns, and this could be the result of some sort of misperception when it comes to comparing the value of having space versus the dangers of being overextended. So it's a bit of a misperception. So the weighing system, the internal weighing system, is something that should really be looked at and potentially recalibrated. because that is the reason why a mistake like that happens. And in here, for example, this bishop d3 is already a sign that Easywithaces was noticing, okay, I've kind of overextended my pawns, I need to support them now, when in reality, this pawn is defending this knight, so what needs support is really the knight. So bishop c4 would have been a better move, or queen b3, queen f3, anything that really gives more support to the knight. This move, bishop d3, is blocking the communication between the queen and a d4 pawn, so once again, not realizing that these pawns need a certain level of protection that is not provided in this position. So sure, he's trying to protect this one, but the pawns are weak not just because of the immediate threat, but really because of the nature of this connected pawns in the center, and the fact that they've been advanced so early without first developing the rest of the pieces and bringing the king to safety. So very good move here by xQc, putting pressure on d4, and this position, all of a sudden, even if black is down a pawn, black is doing absolutely fine here, and it's actually a very interesting position here. Again, many things are possible. We're not going to analyze the game. a3 is a mistake because it's a slow move, and here there's stuff happening in the center. a3 doesn't do anything. You don't want to play a3. Okay, maybe you want to continue b4, b5. It's too slow. It's when you see that there is tension, it's important to emotionally stay connected with the tension, and the feeling of the tension will prevent you from doing something slow. Whenever there is something urgent that needs your attention, you get a certain feeling, and you don't get distracted with slow or less important non-priority type of activities, because you have that feeling that there is something that really requires your attention right now, and you want to develop that feeling when you're playing chess. So it's not enough just to look at the position, say, hey, I have to do this, I have to do that. What you want to do is really develop the feeling of necessity of attending to something before you attend to something else. So something is going to happen imminently, very, very soon. And here this tension is very, very relevant. So here this move is too slow, and capture here on e4 would have been possible. Bishop g7 is also okay. And again, moving the queen, looking for threats, but in reality there is no threat here. And the threat here could be potentially, after a move like king b8, a discovery against this queen. So after king b8, the queen will just have to move back somewhere else. So that's why this move is actually a very bad move. Now, this move, once again, was based on a trap that somehow worked out in the game. So if this knight moves, so if black does this immediately, then queen a7. However, black doesn't need to do that immediately. Black can play a prophylaxis first, so king b8, defending a7, and only then threaten this, and there's really nothing better for white to move the queen back after that. So queen c2, for example. So whenever you have a threat, you really want to focus on what your opponent's reply could be. Here, this is not even a threat. Right now, it's not threatening anything. It's just that it's stopping this knight from capturing, but it's only temporary, and then the queen will have to move again. So once again, extremely important in your own games to understand that if your opponent doesn't fall for a trap, you want to make moves that give you the better position anyway. So if you do something that looks aggressive, think about that. Okay, it looks aggressive, but can my opponent sidestep my initiative and eventually force me to go back and lose time and end up with a worse position? If the answer is yes, then you don't want to make that move. Here, xQc falls for the trap. However, after queen a7 and the objectively bad move c6 is very weak because this king is already weak. But by playing c6, now black is allowing a check here, not immediately, because you don't necessarily want to check here immediately, but in general, just creating more weaknesses. So this square is weaker, and here after something like rook ac1, pinning this pawn, bishop a6, this king is just not going to survive. However, after this, white played the inferior queen a8. So once again, rather than building up the tension, white went for the immediate check. And this is very common among chess players who are just starting, especially beginners, but even some more experienced players. Sometimes it feels good to give a check. Every time you give the check, you hear that sound that the king is in check. You force your opponent to move the king or parry the check in some other way. And you know what? That probably gives a bit of a dopamine boost or something, definitely something happening to our hormones when we check our opponent's king. But at the same time, if it doesn't do anything good for us, we don't want to give that check. So this is not a 3-check game where you give a check, another check, another check, and you win the game. It doesn't work like that. You got a checkmate. If it's not a checkmate, that check is not necessarily better than any other move. So right now it's so much better, as we mentioned already, to build up the tension with rook ac1, for example, which is not the only move, of course. Many other moves are possible, but giving this check with the queen really helps black, because now the queen can go back to b8, and there is actually no easy way for white to keep an advantage here. So now it's very easy for black to defend. Now, another important factor is that here xQc was already very short on time. Now, imagine you're short on time. What's worse? Your opponent giving you a check where you have one only legal move. You can see this square here. It's the only legal move. If you're short on time, do you prefer having to make the only legal move, or do you prefer to have to choose between many options when it's not clear what to do? Of course, you prefer to have it easy and simply having to play the only legal moves. And this is what happened in the game. So rather than building up the tension, forcing black to spend even more time to figure out how to defend in the long run, white is giving this check and then another check. And again, it's all only moves for black. So the clock situation all of a sudden didn't matter anymore, because black is just making the only moves in the position. So again, all these only moves happen, and now this position here, black basically has survived. So it looks like black was in danger, and in fact black was in danger, but right now this queen is going back and this knight is almost trapped. So it looks like black is surviving this. And psychologically, when you're defending against a potentially strong attack and then you survive it, it's easy to really lower your attention and be caught off guard, and then just making a mistake that's going to cost you the game. So here, this knight is almost trapped. Now, this move c5 that was played in the game, sure, it attacks the queen, it wins the tempo, but it's giving away the square d5, and this is crucial, and the game was decided by this mistake, because now this knight that was almost trapped and not very easy to save, all of a sudden this knight is going to become an extremely strong piece, going to d5 with tempo, checking the king. The knight from d5 cannot be chased by any black pawn, because there is no more pawn on c6 or on the e file as well. So what's going to happen is that this knight is going to become a very strong piece. So this c5 is a very big mistake. And knight f3 was possible. Knight f3 was played just one move later, but it's too late. It's too late because now there is no way to stop this penetration here. And it was already a very bad position, but now this move is just a big mistake. The reason it's a big mistake is, first of all, it's a waste of time. Second, it's taking a pawn that is not very relevant when the king is in danger. And third, it's just helping white activate the rooks and getting open files against the king. So this is definitely something you don't want to do. And all of a sudden, every time you play an in-between move, you want to consider your opponent's in-between move. So here, white is attacking this bishop, and the normal thing would be to retreat the bishop. Of course, there's a big problem. white is lost anyway, so it's hard to, black is lost anyway, so it's hard to suggest a good move for black. Probably king d6 is the one that is the most resilient, but the game is still extremely difficult for black. But in general, playing an in-between move like this, saying, hey, you're attacking my bishop, I attack your knight, you gotta consider if white has got another in-between move, and in this case, knight d5. Knight d5 comes with check, saving the knight, the bishop is lost, and the attack will continue. So after this, there wasn't really anything to do. The last chance, but of course this is just lost, there's nothing to do. But here, I would try, at the very least, just before resigning, I would try a move like queen e5, which, okay, the computer says a blunder because it allows mate, but everything else allows mate too. And at least here, if for some reason, for any reason, white doesn't give the mate, we actually threaten mate ourselves. So let's say white thinks, hey, I'm just gonna continue with a4. Very unlikely. I'm telling you, it's very unlikely, but at the very least, we have a mate threat, and this is mate next move. So at the very least, we're still playing for something, even in a completely lost position. But here, okay, black simply retreated with the bishop, and the game ended in a checkmate pretty soon. So this was game one. And let's have a look at game two. So now xQc playing with the white pieces, forced to win on demand. The game started with a Caro-Kann, and again this move bishop d3. This is I can't call this a blunder because it's not a blunder, but it's really a move that shows lack of understanding of how to develop the rest of your pieces. This bishop is getting in the way of this pawn, and if this pawn is not moved, this bishop cannot come out of here, and this will be a problem during the game. And also this pawn would have been probably better off doing something else, maybe taking on d5, maybe being pushed or being supported. So right now it's already not very pleasant for white, but after this bishop g4, this becomes possible. And let's go to the critical moment of the game. First of all, as we mentioned in the previous game as well, this tendency by Easywithaces to overextend their pawns. So here, all of a sudden, with a king in the middle, these pawns look very strong, they're threatening a fork, but at the same time, the king is still in the middle, the pawns can be pinned and attacked as well. So very important to be careful with black. After this move, knight c6, there is already a tactic. And this tactic is something that it's easy to miss. I'm not saying that anyone should see this, it's easy to miss this. But the tactic is arising from misunderstanding the fact that this king is still in the middle. If you play e5 and have a king in the middle, you are really walking into this sort of tactic. The tactic is knight e5. After knight e5, it looks like we're winning the queen, but after bishop takes, knight takes knight with check, and this queen is lost as well. So white is completely winning in that variation. So white didn't see that and played h3, which is therefore a blunder. So there was a case of a mutual blind spot. And again, you may argue that it wasn't easy to spot, but the players, especially xQc playing with white pieces, was definitely familiar with the pattern because it's played something like that before. So it just didn't notice that. And once again, it may come down to the fact that he was already tired after 20 hours of streaming, or for some other reason he wasn't focused enough on seeing that, or sometimes you just have a blind spot. So again, we don't want to be too harsh. It's very, very normal to miss stuff. Everyone misses good combinations pretty much all the time, but it's important to point out that especially if you're familiar with the pattern, whenever you see the elements, you see a king on e8, you see the rook lined up, you see all that stuff, you see that you've got your pieces out and so on in this position, there might be something. So at the very least, using some time to calculate if there is something with knight e5, capturing a pawn and threatening a discovery. So definitely something to consider. So the game continues. And we're gonna go to the next significant mistake. Now b3, okay, it's a mistake positionally, weakening dark square. So this bishop now really didn't want to go there. The bishop could have been developed somewhere else, but those are minor mistakes compared to what's going to happen in just a moment. So here, this wasn't easy to see. So I have to admit that although it is technically a significant mistake to play queen e3, it's not necessarily easy to see why. And the point is, if you look at this pawn chain here, a very important principle in chess is usually one side wants to attack in a direction where the pawn chain is pointing towards. So for example, black has got a pawn chain pointing towards the king side, so black might want to attack towards the king side. So black here really wants to go f5, get the rook into the game, continue with f4, and so on. So black would love to do that, and to do that, the move knight h5 comes to mind. Threatening to go to f4 if allowed. Considering this bishop is now on this diagonal, the bishop is no longer on c1 from where it could have controlled f4. So also because this pawn is on h3, it's harder for white to play g3, controlling f4. So the move knight h5 really comes to mind. So the queen would have been better off pretty much anywhere else, either here or here or here, pretty much anywhere else where it's still controlling the square h5. But after queen a3, knight h5 could come and white could get in trouble, but black also missed that. And here capturing this, again, this is a primarily lack of understanding and not knowing what to do, maybe being a little bit short on time, being tired, because there's really no reason to give up a strong bishop for that knight, which wasn't doing anything. Okay, maybe the knight was going to h5, but now this bishop is going to be very strong. And now it gets interesting, because now there is this pin here, and okay, it looks like black can capture en passant, but after en passant, c3, this pawn will drop. White managed to save the material. Black is still better, but white managed to save the material. But here in this position, this pawn is actually pinned. So a move like c5 is possible where white cannot capture. Now, one of the reasons a mistake like this happens is because a lot of players, especially if they play visually, they look at the board and they see that this pawn is controlling the square. However, strong players get a feeling, when a pawn is pinned, strong players get a feeling that their pawn is not operating to its full potential. So if you see that there is a pin here, all of a sudden you want to develop, and of course you know that because you played d4 to avoid bishop takes rook. So you know right now that this pawn is performing the function of sheltering this rook. So it's important, as soon as you play the move d4, it's important not just to play the move and that's it, but to attach to that move a certain feeling of that pawn not operating to its full potential. So that when a move like c5 is on the cards, and again, that works if you're white or if you're black. So if you're black, you see that and you say, hey, let me attach this feeling to this pawn. This pawn is pinned. This pawn can't necessarily capture just because visually looks like it can capture. And that's how you come up with the move c5. So this was missed because of this specific pattern. And now, okay, a few more moves are played. And we're going to go to the next significant mistake, which is, okay, rook ac1. I mean, this position is already a little bit better for black, but exchanging the rooks is really not what you want to do. Remember, white had to win on demand here. And because white had to win on demand, white, in general, if you want to win on demand, you want to keep more pieces on the board. If you allow a lot of exchange, unless you have a major structural advantage or for any other reason you have much better pieces in terms of the remaining pieces, otherwise trading down is really not a good strategy when you want to win. And here this was allowed. However, the main problem with the move rook ac1 was that it allowed the move bishop g5. And now a moment ago, when this pawn was here, of course, bishop g5 was impossible, and also there were some potential back rank issues. But now, with the pawn on h6, rook c1, bishop g5 is possible, and f4 walks into e takes f3. And now, after takes, the king has got a square to go to, king h7. And this bishop is actually a strong piece. This pawn here is an extra pawn for black right now. This rook is still attacked. If white tries something like rook c3, for example, f takes g2, and this position is actually better for black. So once again, white here had to sidestep the trap, but the game continued like this. And again, rook c8, it's probably not ideal because it misses bishop g5, but in reality, it's a very sound move, just trading down. And here, the last chance after this capture, the last chance for white. White is not better at all. And objectively, you may argue, you know, taking this draw is the only sensible thing to do. However, white was playing for a win. White had to win on demand. A draw or a loss would have been the same for white, just losing the match. So if you want to play for a win, once again, you want to keep more pieces on the board, and therefore keeping the knight and the bishop. Does that mean that there's pressure on f2? Yes, it does. But hey, we gotta take some risks. So after this check and that check here, white here could play something as simple as say king f1, for example. And the reason is now the queen is free to move without allowing bishop f2 with check. And after a move like g6, for example, capturing on d5, black can capture here. Again, white doesn't have any advantage here, but it's a lot easier for black to go wrong in this position rather than in the position that happened in the game. So once again, a very instructive mistake. This is a type of mistake that the computer will not really show, because only a human can know what's harder to play for a human. So the computer will say, hey, white just has to force a draw, but you know what? White needs to win. What's the best way to look for practical chances? Keep the knight on the board. Also remember, queen and knight in general coordinate better than queen and bishop. So that's a slight advantage that white has, despite being down in material, because white lost a couple of pawns earlier on. So in this particular position, white is in fact down one pawn. However, it's possible. Okay, it's possible for white to recapture, but it's also possible for white to simply play knight d6 and immediately go after the king. So again, this position objectively equal, but black has to find a few good moves in order to equalize. What happened in the game was pretty simple for black after this capture. Check, check, and here, of course, we can't talk about mistakes from now on, because it's pretty obvious that white has nothing better than repeating. But white had to win, so white just makes some additional moves, and of course this eventually will result in a loss. So I hope you enjoyed these explanations. We went through a series of blunders that happen, and once again, blunder is perfectly normal. And if you're blundering something like this in your game, in your chess games in general, then I hope these explanations were useful so that you can identify the thought process that leads to a blunder, and your inner game that also leads to a certain blunder, and potentially avoid blundering in the future. So if you like this video, make sure that you subscribe to this channel. As a matter of fact, just write down in the comment if there's something that you notice, if there is any specific takeaway. Just let me know what your main takeaway is from this video, what the main action you're going to take is as a result of watching this video. Maybe you're going to double check certain things, maybe you're going to be more alert for specific patterns. So let me know in the comments what your main takeaway is from this video. And if you like this content, we do upload a lot more content like this that will help you with your chess progress. So by all means, subscribe to this channel, hit the subscribe button, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.